Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, police violence in the U.S. Our guest, Sean Blackmon, organizer with Stop Police Terror Project DC. Sean Blackmon, a warm welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Sean, what is your reaction to the recent shooting of Stephon Clark?
Well, the recent police murder of Stephon Clark in Sacramento, California, I think is just yet another example of the rampant incidents of racist police terror that we've been seeing in the United States, and that I would actually argue is characteristic of the United States in general. I think that it's only, becoming more prevalent in the media over the last few years with the advent of the movement for Black lives. But state-sanctioned violence against Black people, against poor, working, and oppressed people is a feature of this country, certainly from the inception and under its system of capitalism. And we're seeing a rigorous struggle there in Sacramento. His brother, Stephon Clark, has been doing some great work. There's been protests. They've shut down Sacramento Kings games and things like this. So, as always, the movement from the grassroots is really pushing forward the resistance there on the ground.
During the funeral of Stephon Clark, it was Reverend Al Sharpton who delivered the eulogy. And he says, it is time to stop this madness. You think it's going to be any change?
I don't think we're going to see an end to the kind of racist police terror that killed Stephon Clark, that killed DeCynthia Clements recently in Chicago, or another gentleman recently in Houston, Texas, whose name escapes me. We won't see an end to police violence until there is a shift in the police as an institution. And since the police as an institution have so many layers of protection, that literally allows them to get away with murder, this is why we continue to see these things happening, because there is no consequence. And I think what people really have to begin to do is look at the true role that police play within American society. Now, we know that the police are supposedly, sworn to protect and serve, which they do. But what they serve is the interests of the ruling class, and what they protect is their property. So that's what they do. They protect property and not people. And they're also there to serve as a military solution to the social problems that exist in Black communities, in poor, working, and oppressed communities across this country, precisely because of economic underdevelopment. It's no accident that the places where we see so much police terror occurs in communities where there aren't a lot of resources, there aren't a lot of jobs, there aren't jobs with living wages, certainly. There isn't a good education. And this is not a reflection of the people in those communities, it's a reflection of local governments, state governments, national governments not valuing those communities enough to give them those resources.
Devil's advocate, if you analyze most of the incidents that we're talking about, that ended up being shot by the police. Mm-hmm. First part of the incident, you could see, because there are many videos, mm-hmm. the person, regardless of the color, the person does not follow the orders of the police, like don't get close, or stop, or put down your whatever. And after that, you could start to say, the level of violence that they use to repress the fact that they don't follow the orders could be very questionable or extreme. Do you agree that there's a part of those incidents that the person do not follow the orders of the police?
Well, to be frank, this whole notion that, all these people aren't following instructions, I think is just a notion put forth by the police. I think it's a myth, frankly.
Okay, but let me interrupt you. Okay, but we have videos.
Sure.
We have videos saying to, for example, a person, regardless of the color, sure. Stop, do this. Okay. And they do not. And they just start to run. So the violence, according to the other side of this story, is when they start to run, when they start to come towards the police, mm-hmm. when they take a car and they leave the scene.
Right.
We can see it in the video. Is something that could be proven. So the other side of this coin is, again, my question.
Right.
Do you accept that there's a part at fault of the person that is involved in that police incident, or is totally innocent and victim?
Well, I don't think it's quite that simple. There's a few things. Number one, I don't believe that someone disobeying an order from a police is a crime worthy of death. I don't, and frankly, and I don't know about anyone else, if a person comes towards me with the gun, I'm inclined to run. I think that's a natural reaction. You see what I mean? And also, we need to also point out that there are people who do comply with police who still end up.
That's why I was mentioning to you the incidents where do not comply. Yeah. So, for the third time, the same question. Do you accept that there is a part of responsibility of the person that do not respect the following the orders of a police person?
Well, the fact of the matter is, the police are.
So the answer is what?
It's not as simple as yes and no. That's what I'm saying, because the police in that equation are the ones who hold all the power. They have the gun, they have the institutional protection.
And it's not, okay, but the police is not to do that? I mean, it's not the police, the function of the police is to do that, to decide at that point, society don't appoint them to decide if you are following the rules or the law?
I'm saying that not following the rules is not a reason to be killed.
So that is the second part of the story. But for the fourth time, I want to ask you the same question. Do you accept that there's a part of responsibility of a citizen, regardless of the color, that if they do not follow the orders of a police officer, is something that is wrong?
I'm afraid I just can't answer it as simply as you'd like. I'm sorry, because it's just that at the end of the day, police, they're trigger happy. They're trained to kill regardless of whatever, regardless of the fact that they have non-lethal means at their disposal as well. I mean, these are knee-jerk reactions that we're seeing, and that's why it's so difficult for me to answer that question, because what you're saying is, I feel like you're asking me if a person moves towards a police officer, do they deserve to die? And I think the answer is no. And when you ask
Except if the police officer said to you, do not move, stay there, stop. It's not that he's walking to the police because walking to the police. Sure. He's saying, follow the order that I am. As an officer of the order of my country, he's asking you, you stop.
I'm saying that if the reaction of a person disobeying you is to murder them, that is wrong. And that's why it's difficult for me to answer the responsibility question, because it's putting all the onus on a person who doesn't have who does not have nearly the institutional power or protection of that police as an individual or an institution. There's a clear difference. There's a gap in power that happens there, and that's why it's difficult for me to answer that question, because again, if a person, again, disobeying a rule, I don't think is a reason to be murdered, and that's what we see in so many incidents. And even if we look at the Stephen Clark case specifically, that's not even really the issue at hand. They had saying that there had been some slew of robberies or something, and then they were saying that he supposedly had a toolbar, was breaking car windows and things like that, which was not true. And they saw some object in his hand, which ultimately ended up to be a cell phone. And this is the issue at hand, is that the fear of police in a white supremacist country like the United States, the fear of police is considered more valuable than people's lives. And that is why we continue to see these things. And that is why I say that ultimately the change has to happen within the police as an institution, because we've seen time and again that it frankly doesn't matter what the person does. If they obey what the police says, they die. If they don't, they die. If they've been an upright, upstanding citizen their entire life, they die. If they've had issues with the law, they die. So the issue is not with poor working and oppressed communities. The issue is not with the victims of police terror. It's with the murderous institution of police who are put in place to do just that.
You were mentioning white supremacy.
Yes.
Did white supremacy got worse since Donald Trump is in the White House?
Worse, no. White supremacy has been a reality in this country since inception. I would say since Christopher Columbus first came to this part of the world. What has happened with the election of Donald Trump is that white supremacists now feel more comfortable in being public, because there was a time when there was a social consequence for being publicly racist. But when you have someone like Donald Trump, who ran on a campaign of racism, who ran on a campaign of virulent anti-immigrant sentiment, now that is what empowered all these new groups and the so-called alt-right, but I don't use that term, I just call them what they are. They're the new white supremacist movement. So this is why we're seeing an uptick in racist attacks, because people, these racists, think that they can do these things and not have any consequence, because they feel emboldened, because they see these very same sort of attitudes coming from the highest office in the land.
Tell me about statistics regarding the gun violence against the African American community compared to gun violence against the white community in terms of figures. Much more.
Sure. I'm not exactly sure what the numbers are in terms of gun violence or police violence against white people, but I can tell you that the police do kill a black person every 28 hours in this country.
And it's about 7 times more likely an African American people to be shot by a gun of a police than a non-African American, at least.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I would say so, because, and again, it comes down to this issue of racial attitudes and the fact that black people are perceived as a threat under a racist system, frankly, no matter what we do, you know, to the point I was making earlier. So it doesn't matter what kind of education you have, or if you come from a 2-parent home, or if you pay your taxes and all those sorts of things. It doesn't matter. The content of your character actually doesn't matter. It's just that from the time of enslavement up until today, black people are stereotyped as this sort of violent, brutish group of people who need to be put down like beasts. And that's why the police treat black folks the way that they do.
Is there unity among the African American community? Is there a leader? When we see, for example, Reverend Al Sharpton delivering the eulogy, we see him. Sometimes we see other leaders. How the black community works around a country of 300 million people?
Well, I mean, with any community, I mean, there's a diversity of opinions. And one thing that is agreed upon, I will say, is that, racist police terror is a problem, obviously, within black America. Now, the fact that I would even use that language is different. Some folks would never call it terror. They may say police brutality or police misconduct and things like that. I think the difference comes in the analysis of why it happens and what can be done to stop it. And I mean, in terms of leadership, I mean, there's always going to be public leaders. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Al Sharpton and people like this. For me, I put my confidence in the kind of grassroots, community-led efforts that resist these sorts of things, which is precisely what we're seeing in Sacramento around the Stephen Clark killing. It's what we saw in Baltimore around Freddie Gray, what we saw in Ferguson around Mike Brown, and so on and so forth. I think that is where the real power lies, not in individuals.
What about your movement? What are you doing exactly here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, in Washington, D.C., we have racist police terror issues of our own. I mean, the cop that killed Terrence Sterling a little while ago just got off. When I first got to D.C., there was a police killing of a 18-year-old black man named Raphael Briscoe. So-called special police killed Alonzo Smith in Southeast D.C. So we see our role here locally is to connect the incidents of police murder here in D.C. to where we see them in other parts of the country. And I think that is how we begin to sort of unify the movement and understand that they happen in all these different places for the same reasons, because we're all living under the same system. And that is why we need a unified and collective strike against that system to actually put an end to these issues that we're seeing.
How would you characterize the way that the minorities are being treated in the U.S. under President Trump. I mean, we're talking not only the African Americans, we're talking the Hispanic community, we're talking about the refugees, we're talking about religious people, especially Muslims. How would you say that is life under Trump for these minority communities?
I would say it's open season. And I want to reiterate that, non-white people and oppressed folks, have always been in danger in this country. But when I say it's open season, it's again because of this same notion of open racism now being considered acceptable. So, I mean, I would describe it as dangerous. I mean, we saw what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the Unite the Right rally with all these white supremacist groups coming together. I mean, Heather Heyer, who was a white woman, was killed. So and I want to point that out as well, because not only are people of color in danger, but any white person that doesn't fall in line with white supremacy is also very much in danger. Really, anyone that doesn't fall in line with this kind of cisgendered, heterosexual, patriarchal, capitalist system is at risk. If you don't fall in lockstep with that, with the establishment and with these deeply reactionary and racist policies, you're not safe either.
What about the Black Lives Matter movement? Where is it, and how is the connection of your organization with the movement?
Yes, well, the Stop Police Terror Project DC, we're not directed connectly with the Black Lives Matter organization, the network. A lot of people get that confused. But we're definitely connected with sort of the broader movement, not only against racist police terror, but really against all forms of state-sanctioned violence. Because the way we see it, if a cop pulls out his gun and shoots you, that's just an act. You see what I mean? That's one act of sort of existential violence, I guess. But when you look at broader issues that are facing black people in this country, Latin folks in this country, and other communities in terms of, again, sort of their material conditions, the way that they live, how they're able to make a living and support their children and educate their children and things like this. The way that America and the American government writ large underdevelops those communities by taking resources out or not giving them, we see that as violence too. And so what we're seeing in the broader movement for Black Lives is, I would say, not a move away, I would say it's a move away from focusing solely on police brutality. We still focus on it, but it's become more of a thing of understanding how racist police terror connects to a broader experience of racism in this country and how it affects different groups of oppressed people in different ways.
We have seen in recent days here in Washington, D.C., that the march of organized by the students who survived the massacre in the high school in Florida. And what do you think about that supposed to be a new movement, the Never Again, organized by these kids, if you want? How you see it?
Well, personally, I am very encouraged by seeing so many young people mobilized so young. They're smart, they're savvy. Even if I disagree with some of their points politically, I think generally speaking it's very good, because it's always, young people are always at the vanguard of any movement, and we can see that at any epoch in this country's history. What I think the danger is how these young people face being demobilized by both sides of America's two-party system. So you have the Republicans who are just sort of openly reactionary and are against the kids because they think that they're gonna take their guns or whatever. They think that that they're gonna be some kind of threat to their ability to have as many weapons or whatever as they want, and to be able to use them however they want. And then on the other hand, you have Democrats and liberals who want to try to co-opt that movement. So basically to shore up their own fading relevance, because particularly after this last election with Hillary Clinton, people have lost a lot of faith in the Democrat Party, and I should say the Democrat Party establishment, and this sort of, and these neoliberal politics and things like that. So I have seen, Democrats and liberals try to seize upon these young people to try to give themselves some relevance again, while the right wing is trying to sort of siphon off that energy completely and doesn't want to see that sort of protest at all. So it is my hope that these young people are able to weather the maelstrom of the kind of exploitation and manipulation that people could lob at them, and to be able to press toward the mark, if you will, and to continue on. And what I think will happen is we'll see a sharpening of the politics for some of them. Now, I don't doubt that some of them will sort of go into sort of the liberal mainstream sort of things, but I think we'll definitely see some progressive personalities emerge out of this moment.
Bernie Sanders says, for example, regarding the gun control, regarding the influence of the lobbyists here in Washington, and most definitely the NRA are, according to Bernie Sanders, buying the congressmen in order to have legislation on their favor. Most definitely, that's exactly what the kids are fighting against, more gun control. Jimmy Carter, in a few weeks ago, mentioned, just because of that gun control battle, he said, the US, the United States, is an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. Do you agree?
100%. 100%. The only thing that I would like to add, we have to be very careful when we have this conversation about gun control, because what happens is that whatever gun sort of reform legislation that we tend to get, it usually serves at the end of the day to sort of further disarm communities that are already vulnerable, like Black communities, like Latin communities, and other oppressed communities like this. Those groups are further disarmed, and the police and the military are more heavily armed. And particularly when we're in a moment now where we're seeing an increasingly militarized police institution with all kinds of not only weaponry, but in terms of technology for surveillance and things like this, that really creates a more dangerous situation for oppressed people. And so that's why I take issue a lot of time with liberal gun reforms and things like that, because on the right-wing side of things, right-wingers want to protect themselves from non-white people. That's what, and even though, and sure, they have a handful of people of color on their side or whatever, that's fine. That's tokenism. But basically, they want the right for white people to arm themselves against non-white people. And so on the other extreme, you have liberals who want there to be, less weapons on the civilian side. You see what I mean? And so that is what tends to embolden and further empower the police and the military and stuff. And that's why, and when you have a situation where the police are already a heavy presence in Black communities and oppressed communities, that's why I say it creates a more dangerous situation, because you're giving bigger and better guns to people who have proven that they are murderers.
April 4th, 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. Tell me what represents for the African American community.
Well, I think we would do well to focus on what Martin Luther King called the interrelated triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and war. And these are the politics of Martin Luther King that never get discussed in the mainstream. If you notice, they always focus on the I Have a Dream speech, which was inspirational in tone, but contained very little, if any, political substance. And in my opinion, is one of the worst public addresses he made for just that reason. So when we talk about the interrelated triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and war, Martin Luther King came to understand that war abroad was an enemy of the poor at home. And that was the language he used. He said war was an enemy of the poor, because all the money and resources that were going into building bombs and tanks and jets and all this weaponry that was going to kill people in a different part of the world, whether it's Vietnam then or Yemen now or other conflicts that the U.S. is involved in, that takes resources away from people who already have very little right here in the United States. So this is why Martin Luther King, towards the end of his life, became to have a more radical politics. His politics became more openly anti-imperialist and anti-war, because he understood how not only is war abroad a negative thing from a moral standpoint, but it had a direct negative impact on the material conditions of people right here in this country. And that is why the state saw fit.
Those three issues are still very present in the life of the U.S.?
Absolutely, because we still see very extremely difficult material conditions in oppressed communities today, just like we saw then. Because the war machine, what people call the military-industrial complex, that's still rolling on. I mean, we know America could cut its military budget in half and would still have one of, if not the largest military budget in the world. And it's all because of what we're experiencing here in this unit. I mean, think of what all those billions and billions of dollars that go to the war machine. Think of what that could do for the education system in the United States. Think of what that money could do in terms of giving people a living wage, which is something that Martin Luther King called for. And not only did he call for a living wage, he called for the wage to be commensurate with the cost of living that would rise along with it. You see what I mean? And so, you know, he sort of, you know, he was a kind of a, you could say a forerunner for like the Fight for 15 movement in that sense. But even that, in a place like Washington, D.C., where we are, for instance, $15 an hour is good and certainly more than a lot of people get. But the living wage for Washington, D.C. is almost like $30 an hour. You see what I mean? And so think of the kind of social benefit. Think of how gratified people in the communities in the United States would be if these billions and billions of dollars would go to help them live better lives and achieve their human potentials instead of literally going to blowing people up.
Sean Blackmon, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.